Chapter 45 of Arrah Neil by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 45. The attempt upon Hull had been abandoned, and, mortified and desponding, Charles I had quitted Beverley and pursued his march through the land. The Earl of Essex lay in force at Northampton, but no show of energy announced at this time the successes which the parliamentary armies were ultimately to obtain. The mightier spirits had not yet risen from the depth, and the ostensible engines with which faction worked were, as usual, the cunning artifice, the well-told lie, the exaggerated grievance, the suppressed truth, the dark insinuation, by which large classes, if not whole nations, may be stirred up either for good or evil. There was activity in all the small and petty arts of agitation. There was activity in those courses which prepare the way for greater things, but in that which was to decide all, arms, tardiness, if not sloth, was alone apparent. It is strange, in reviewing all great political convulsions, to remark how petty are the events and how small are really the men by which great success is obtained, though insignificant incidents swell into importance by their mass, and mean characters gain a reflected sublimity from the vastness of the results by which their deeds are followed. Even individual vices and weaknesses acquire a certain grandeur under the magnifying power of important epochs, and from the uses to which they are turned. And the hypocrisy of Cromwell and the bombast of Napoleon, which would have excited little but contempt in less prominent persons, appear in a degree sublime by being displayed on a wider stage, and employed as means to a mightier end. We are too apt to judge of efforts by results, as of people by their success, noticing but little, in the appreciation of men's characters, one of the chief elements which distinguish the great from the little, the objects which they propose to themselves, and, in our judgment of their skill, taking into small account the difficulties that opposed and the facilities that favoured the accomplishment of their designs. And it is curious to remark that the revolutions which have carried great usurpers into power have always raised the ambitious and left the patriotic behind, as if human selfishness were the only motive which can ensure that continuity of effort and unity of purpose which alone can command success amongst the struggles of diverse factions and development of infinitely varied opinions. The Earl of Essex was a higher-minded man than Cromwell, but he had doubts and hesitations which Cromwell's ambition would not entertain, and there can be but little doubt that he was unwilling to strike the first irrevocable blow against an army commanded by his sovereign in person. Doubtless he fancied, as many did, that the small force collected tardily by a monarch without supplies would speedily melt away, and leave Charles, from sheer necessity, to accept any terms that the Parliament chose to dictate. But whatever was the cause, the king was permitted to march to Shrewsbury unopposed, while the parliamentary forces lay inactive at Northampton. The reception given to the monarch in the town was such as to encourage high hopes in all, and as Wales was rising in his favour, it was judged expedient that Charles should visit the principality in person, while the army recruited itself on the banks of the Severn, and every effort was made to obtain a supply of arms and money. Provisions, indeed, were abundant. The royalist troops were regularly paid. Greater order and more perfect discipline were maintained than had ever before been observed in the army, and a state of calm and cheerful enjoyment reigned in the good old town, which is but too seldom known in civil wars. Such was the state of things when, one evening, a little before sunset, just after the king had left Shrewsbury for Wales, two persons, a gentleman and a lady, wandered along through the fields on the banks of the river, once more full of happy dreams and hopes of bright hours to come. Lord Beverley gazed down into his fair companion's eyes as she lifted her sunny look towards his fine expressive face, and he saw in those two worlds of light the deep pure love of which he had so often dreamed, while Annie Walton, in the countenance of him who regarded her with such fond thoughtfulness, read the intense and passionate tenderness which alone can satisfy the heart, and teach the spirit of woman to repose with calm security on the love of her future husband. It is too late in the tale either to paint the feelings which were in the bosom of each at that moment, or to tell the words of dear affection that they spoke. The thrill of mutual attachment, the trembling flutter of the heart as she thought of the near approaching hour, the glad eagerness of his to make her his own beyond the power of fate, the visions of future joy, and the long vistas of happy years which the warm imagination of each presented, not the less bright and sparkling because, on her side as on his, though from different causes, vague clouds and indistinct shadows hung over parts of the scene which fancy painted. Come what might, in a few days they were to be united, and that was enough for the hour. They had been long talking over their plans and prospects. The old house of Longnigh Hall was to be their abode for the next 3 weeks. Their marriage was to be as private and quiet as even Annie Walton's heart could desire, and the circumstances of the times gave fair excuse for cutting off all ceremonies and casting away all formal delays. Of 3 weeks they thought themselves secure, and within that little space was bounded all the real lifetime of their hopes. Beyond, what was beyond, who could say? And yet they dreamed of days long after, and fancy looked over the prison walls of the present, and told them of fair scenes and glowing landscapes, which only her eye could descry. "I could have wished," said Annie Walton after a pause, "that Charles could have been married on the same day." The Earl smiled. "Then you see it now, beloved," he replied. "Nay, Frances, who could help seeing it?" asked Miss Walton. "Arrah herself must see and know it, and yet she seems not so happy, not so cheerful, as I should have thought such knowledge would make her, for I am very sure that she has loved him long, and at one time I feared for and pitied her." "And he has loved her long too, Annie," replied the Earl, "longer than you believe, or he himself knew. This passion has been growing like a flower in the spring, first in the bud as pity, then showing its first hues as deep interest and tenderness, then partly expanding, like the timid blushing blossom, which seems to fear that even the green leaves around should look into its glowing breast, and at last, on a bright warm day, opening wide to the bright sun. Charles Walton, when first I saw your own dear eyes at Bishop's Merton, felt love, or something very like it, for Arrah Neil, and yet he would have been strangely hurt if any had told him that he ever thought of the poor wild cottage girl with aught but mere compassion." "You men are strange things," replied Annie Walton with a sigh and a smile at the same time, "and yet I am not without my fears for that dear child. Unless the proofs of who she is can be found and clearly made out, what will be Charles's conduct?" "I will tell you, love," answered Lord Beverley. "Pride will yield, Annie, to the noblest and strongest quality of your brother's heart, the sense of honour. He has displayed his love for her too openly to herself for Charles Walton to hesitate. Other men might do so, and think themselves justified in sacrificing both her peace and their own affection to the cold judgment of the world. But if a time should come when he has to ask himself what he is to Arrah Neil, still poor, still unknown in position, and even in name, he will feel himself plighted to her by the words and looks of these days, and, as I have said, he will not hesitate." "I trust it may be so," replied the lady, "and indeed I think it will, for he is generous and kind. But yet I wish this man would return with the papers that he undertook to bring. Here several weeks have passed, and no tidings have been heard of him. Surely that sad hypocrite Dry cannot have bribed him." "Oh no," exclaimed the Earl with a laugh. "All men have their own notions of honour, dearest, and though he is loose and dissolute, a babbler and a braggadocio, yet his courage and his fidelity are beyond doubt. If he is not dead, he will come back. But what is that lying in the grass?" "Good heaven! It is a dead man!" cried Annie Walton, turning pale. "Nay, someone asleep rather," said her lover. "He is not like the dead. See, his arm is folded to pillow his head. Wait here a moment, Annie, and I will go and see." Lord Beverley advanced to the spot where the person had been speaking of was stretched in the long grass, and gazed upon him for an instant without speaking. Then, taking him by the arm, he shook him gently to rouse him, and with a start the sleeper sat up and gazed around. "Good gracious me!" he cried as he awoke. "Where am I? Ah, my lord the Earl, is that you? Well, this is a lucky chance, indeed." "Why, how came you to be sleeping here, Master Folgate?" inquired the Earl, "and how did you get out of Hull?" "I came here on the carriage provided by nature, my good lord," answered the painter, "and I was sleeping because I could not keep my eyes open. To get out of Hull was no difficulty, but to get out of Worcester was hard work indeed." And he went on to relate how he had travelled on foot from Hull to Worcester, and there, having ventured upon some loyal speeches over a cup of ale, had found himself speedily under charge of a guard, from whom he escaped after innumerable obstacles, which need not be detailed to the reader, and had walked from that city to the neighbourhood of Shrewsbury, a distance of more than 47 miles, between the preceding midnight and 1 o'clock of that day, when, utterly exhausted, he had lain down to rest and fallen asleep. "This is an old friend of mine, dear Annie," said the Earl, turning to Miss Walton, who had come up slowly when she saw that the poor painter was not dead; "and as he showed good discretion in my case, at a very critical moment, we must do what we can for him. So, Master Folgate," he continued, "the good folks of Worcester seem very rebelliously inclined to treat you so harshly for a few loyal words." "Good faith! my noble lord, the men of Worcester had little to do with it," replied Folgate. "It was Lord Essex's soldiers that were so barbarous to poor me. Have you not heard that he took up his quarters at Worcester yesterday?" "No, indeed," said the Earl, a cloud coming over his countenance at the thought of fresh dangers and delays. "No, indeed; but come with us into the city, Folgate. Your intelligence must be valuable; and as for yourself, I must do what I can to place you in some good regiment of foot." "No, no, my lord," answered the painter. "I have done with soldiering. I was never made for it. I do not like to paint men's faces with blood, or to see it done. All that you can do for me is to bring me to speak to a noble gentleman named Lord Walton, if such a thing is ever to take place; for I have hunted him to Beverley, to York, to Nottingham, and then finding the Roundheads in the way, in an unlucky day took Worcester on my road hither. So I do think I shall never see him." "Nothing can be more easy, my good friend," answered the Earl. "Lord Walton is here, and this lady is his sister. Come with us, and you will see him in a few minutes." The poor painter, who was not without his share of taste, was delighted at his meeting with Miss Walton, whose beautiful face and form were ready passports to his respect and admiration. Nor did her words and manner produce less effect, for to the heart of Annie, the least service rendered to him she loved made the doer interesting in her eyes; and with gentle tones and kindly looks she told poor Diggory Folgate that she had heard of him and of his discretion from Lord Beverley, and thanked him deeply for the caution he had shown. Had Diggory Folgate been Captain Bearcolt, she would instantly have had a full account of all that had been done to save the Earl, by informing Sir John Hotham of his situation, together with various additions and improvements, which would have left all the honour of his deliverance with the worthy narrator. But Folgate, to whom the presence of beauty had something almost awful in it, did not even take to himself the credit that was rightly his due, but walked on nearly in silence beside the Earl and his fair companion, till, entering the town of Shrewsbury, they reached the house where Lady Margaret Langley and her young relations had taken up their abode, near the Wellington gate of the city. "Is Lord Walton within?" the Earl demanded, addressing one of the servants in the old porch, and the answer was, "Yes, my lord, he is in the small room on the left with my lady." And leading Annie on, Folgate following close behind, Lord Beverley entered the chamber, saying, "Here is a good friend of mine, Charles, who brings you tidings from Hull." Lord Walton rose from a seat between that of Lady Margaret and fair Arrah Neil, gazing upon the painter through the dim evening light, which found its way in at the tall lattice window, without the slightest recollection of his face, as indeed he had never before seen him. But the moment that Folgate beheld Arrah Neil, he advanced a step or two towards her, then stopped and hesitated, for her dress was much altered, and then went on again, but with a timid and doubtful air. Arrah, however, welcomed him with a kindly smile, holding out her hand to him, and saying, "Ah, Master Folgate, I am glad to see you safe. This is the person whom I mentioned, Charles, who aided my escape from Hull." "He deserves all our thanks, dear Arrah," replied Charles Walton, "and every recompense that we can give him. But did I understand right, sir, that you have business with me?" "Why, I had, my noble lord," answered Folgate, in a somewhat faltering tone; but as I have found this young lady, I think it is to her I should speak, for the business is her own. I only asked for your lordship because I had heard that you were her best friend." "Oh yes, indeed he is!" exclaimed Arrah Neil, warmly; "and whatever is to be said had better be said to him. He can judge rightly of things that I do not understand." "Well then, speak to me here, sir," said Lord Walton, retiring towards the window. "You had better come too, Arrah, for we may want you in our council." Folgate followed to the other side of the room, and Arrah Neil rose and joined them, while Annie Walton seated herself beside her aunt, and Lord Beverley took a seat placed on the other side of Lady Margaret's chair, engaging her attention by an account of their walk. Nor was it accidentally that he did so, for he knew that at that moment, though the fine countenance of the old dame was calm, there were many thoughts and memories, many doubts and hopes, busy in her bosom, far too busy for her peace. In the meantime he turned his eyes every now and then towards the window, against which appeared the fine and dignified form of Lord Walton, the light of evening shining full upon his lordly brow and chiselled features, and the sweet profile of Arrah Neil, with the graceful outline of her figure, all in deep shade. The painter seemed speaking eagerly as they listened, and from time to time Charles Walton bent his head or asked a question, while Arrah Neil, her face inclined towards the ground, once or twice raised her handkerchief to her eyes, and seemed to wipe away a tear. At length the painter drew forth from his pocket a small packet, which he placed in Lord Walton's hands, and a slip of paper which he held while the young nobleman eagerly examined the contents of the packet. They seemed various, some of them being letters and scraps of parchment, some small trinkets. While he gazed upon them all, one after the other, Charles Walton gave them to Arrah Neil, first, however, drawing her arm through his own, as if to support her. Then, taking the paper from Folgate's hand, he attentively read what was written on it, and turning once more to his fair companion, he kissed her tenderly, adding a few words, the last of which sounded like "my dear cousin." Lady Margaret Langley caught them and started up, but instantly resumed her seat, and Lord Walton, taking Arrah's hand in his, while he supported her trembling steps with his arm, led her forward to the old lady's chair. The fair girl sank upon her knees, and bent her head before Lady Margaret, while in a low and solemn voice the young nobleman said, "My dear aunt, it is as you have dreamed. This sweet girl is your child's child." Lady Margaret said not a word, but cast her arms round Arrah Neil, bent her brow upon her fair neck, and wept in silence; then raised her tearful eyes towards heaven, and sobbed aloud. The old staghound, too, as if he comprehended all and shared in all, approached, and with a low whine licked his mistress's withered hand. She speedily grew calm, however, and looking up to her nephew, without taking her arm from Arrah's neck, she asked, "But is it all true, Charles? Is it all proved? Is she the heiress of my house?" "Nothing but a few minute links in the chain of evidence are wanting," replied Lord Walton, "and quite enough is proved, my dear aunt, to leave no doubt whatever on our minds, as I will show you, though other papers indeed are wanting at present, which might be needful to establish her rights and legitimacy in a court of law. Whatever may be its decision, however, to us she must be ever our own dear cousin, Arabella Tyrone." "Ah, no, no!" cried the poor girl, starting up and clasping her hands. "Still Arrah Neil to you, Charles, to all of you, still Arrah Neil." Lord Walton gazed on her with a look of earnest tenderness, and a faint smile crossed his fine lip. Perhaps he thought that, whatever was her name for the time, she would soon be Arabella Walton. But he would not agitate her more at that moment, and was about to proceed with the account he was rendering to Lady Margaret, when Lord Beverley advanced and extended his arms to Arrah Neil. She gazed upon him in surprise, but he pressed her to his bosom warmly, eagerly, and kissed her brow, exclaiming, "Fear not, dear child, fear not. The same blood flows in your veins as in mine. I am not deceived, Lady Margaret. Her father was my mother's brother. Is it not so?" "It is," said Lady Margaret. "Ask me no questions yet, my child. He is your cousin, and he and his have forgiven me and mine. I trust that God has forgiven us, and you may have to do so too, when you hear all. Say, will you do it, Arrah?" The fair girl fell upon her neck and kissed her, and Annie Walton then claimed her share of tenderness, though to her the tale had been developed more gradually, and was not heightened by surprise. It was a strange and touching scene, however, even to one who witnessed it, like the poor painter, without any personal interest in the recovery of the lost lamb; and Falgate's eyes were as full of tears as those of the rest, when he was called forward by Lord Walton to give an account of how he had found the packet which he had brought that day. His tale was somewhat confused, and the particulars need not be related here, as the reader is already acquainted with them. But when he spoke of the account given by the good hostess of the inn, and pointed out the facts she had written down, when he detailed his visit to the vault and the opening of the coffin, Lady Margaret Langley sobbed aloud, exclaiming, "My child! my child! Ah, didst thou die so near me, and no mother's hand to close thine eyes?" When she had somewhat recovered, however, she took the tokens and the papers which had been found in the coffin, and gazed upon them one after the other, with many a sad comment. There were 2 rings she recollected well. One she had given herself, and a small gold circlet for the brow. It was on her child's 16th birthday, she said, the last she ever spent within her father's halls. Then she read the certificate of marriage, and a short statement of events, in a hand that she knew too well, wiping the bitter drops from her eyes that she might see the words; and then she kissed the name written below, and drawing Arrah to her heart, embraced her long. At length she looked round and asked, "What is there wanting, Charles? All doubt is done away." "To us it is, my dear aunt," answered Lord Walton; "but the law will require proof that this dear girl, so long called Arrah Neil, is the same as the child whom old Sergeant Neil brought from Hull to Bishop's Merton many years ago. Those proofs, I hope, will soon be found. Indeed, I expected that they would have been brought hither ere now. Some strange delay has taken place, but doubtless some mere accident has caused it, and at all events we are satisfied." Miss Walton whispered something to her brother as he ended, to which he replied quickly, "You are right, Annie, I will do it. Stay with my aunt and cheer her till we return. There is a tale to be told to this dear girl," he said, speaking to Lady Margaret, "which is too sad for you to tell. Let me do it, my dear aunt. I know all the facts." "Ay, but not the feelings, Charles," replied the old lady. "Yet do so if you will. I can tell the rest hereafter, when I am calmer, for this will pass away. I never thought to have shed tears again. I fancied the fountains were dried up. Tell her, Charles, tell her, but not here." "No, I will speak with her in the dining hall," replied Lord Walton. "Come, dear Arrah, it is better to perform a painful task at once." And taking her hand, he led her from the room. Chapter 46 of Arrah Neil by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 46. It was a large old hall, lined with black oak. The sun was setting, but setting in splendour, and the rich rosy light poured in through the windows, casting a faint glow upon the old carved wreaths and glistening panels. "Perhaps," said Lord Walton, as they entered and he closed the door, I had better order them to bring lights, dear Arrah, for the sun will be down ere my tale is told." "Oh no," answered Arrah Neil, "there will be light enough for so sad a story as this must be, and we can sit in this window where we can see the last look of day." Her cousin led her to one of those old-fashioned window-seats where many of us have sat in our own youth, and took his place beside his fair companion, gazing with her for a moment upon the evening sky. At length, with a start, as if he had forgotten for a time the cause of their coming, he said, "But to my tale, Arrah. Many years ago, my poor aunt fancied herself the happiest of women. Far from courts and crowds, in the midst of wild scenes that suited her turn of mind, with a husband who loved her deeply, and a daughter whom they both adored. Sir Richard was, however, a soldier of much renown, and in the wars of Ireland he carried Lady Margaret and their child to Dublin. They there became first acquainted with a young Irish nobleman, nearly related to that great man, for I must call him so, though he was a rebel, the celebrated Earl of Tyrone. Your mother was then but a child, dear Arrah, and this nobleman a youth. But after the return of Sir Richard and his wife to Langley Hall, he came to visit his eldest sister, who was then married to the Earl of Beverley. Near neighbourhood produced intimacy, and the Irish noble and the English knight differed on many a point. In mere opinion, it is true, but the effect was such, that when the young man asked the hand of the old man's daughter, it was refused with some discourtesy. Lady Margaret herself would not hear of such a marriage, though rank, station, and fortune all were his. But she loved not to part with her daughter, and still less to part with her for a land which she looked upon as barbarous and full of strife. Your father, Arrah, was rash and vehement, impatient of opposition, and easily moved to every daring deed, though generous, kind, and full of honour. He had gained your mother's love too, and he knew it, and when he left Langley Hall, rejected in his suit, he vowed that 6 months should not pass ere she should be his bride. Not 6 weeks went by when, after going out to walk, sad and lonely as had become her custom, she did not return. Search was made, but she could not be found, and no certain information was to be obtained. One man had heard a distant cry, one had seen a ship hovering on the coast hard by, and several had met a troop of men, strangers evidently, both from their dress and language, wandering near Langley Hall. A few weeks of terrible suspense passed, and then Lady Margaret received a letter in her daughter's hand, signed Arabella Tyrone. It told of her marriage with him she loved, and that love was openly acknowledged. There was indeed a vague hint given that she had not gone willingly, nor intentionally disobeyed her parents, but no details were afforded. The answer was written in anger, bidding her neither see them nor write to them more, and Sir Richard, remembering the vow of him who was now his son-in-law, swore that he would find a time to make him beg for pardon on his knees. Years passed ere that bitter vow could be exercised. Your father, for the sake of an adored wife, bent his spirit to sue by letter for forgiveness and oblivion of the past. But that did not satisfy the stern old man, and at length his time came. Fresh troubles broke out in Ireland. Sir Richard Langley received a fresh command, and against your father, then, alas, preparing to take arms against the government. He chiefly urged an expedition. That country has always had divisions and feuds in its own bosom, and a party of the enemies of Tyrone were easily found to join their efforts to a small body of regular troops, and guide them through the passes to your father's castle. "I remember it well," said Arrah Neil, "and the terrace looking to the mountains." "When Sir Richard found that he whom he sought was absent with his wife and child," continued Lord Walton, "and that there was likely to be the most desperate resistance without fruit, he was inclined to pause, and perhaps might have retreated, but those with whom he was now acting overruled his will. They would not hear of delay or hesitation, with their enemy's hold before them. He remonstrated in vain. The attack commenced, and though he took no part therein, and likewise restrained his men, he had the grief of seeing his daughter's dwelling taken, pillaged, and burned to the ground before his eyes. There, alas, perished, dear Arrah, the poor sister of my friend, your cousin, and the sight of her blackened remains, which at first he would hardly believe were not yours, though he had before been told were not there, turned the heart of Sir Richard Langley to more charitable thoughts. He repented bitterly, but the cup of his chastisement was not yet full. Your father, after having seen your mother and yourself embark to seek refuge in Holland, was taken by a party of the old knight's troops, demanded by the government as a state prisoner, and in spite of every effort, remonstrance, prayer, and petition, was tried and executed as a traitor. Pardon me, dear Arrah, that I speak such harsh words, and do so without trying to soften them, for I wish to be as brief as may be. Arrah Neil wept but made no answer, and Lord Walton went on. Amongst those who most earnestly entreated for your father's life were Sir Richard Langley and my aunt, Lady Margaret. But those were times, Arrah, when pampered sovereignty had never known the softening touch of adversity, and flatterers and knaves were heard when the honest and true was scorned. Naught availed, and the old knight gave himself up to bitter remorse. Your poor mother was sought for, and every post took a letter to some one of those lands which it was supposed she might have visited. But no such person was found, and at length a vague rumour reached Langley Hall that she and her child were dead. Whence it came, what was its foundation, no one could discover. But as year rolled on after year, and no tidings arrived, the report was credited. The old man accused himself of murdering his daughter and her husband, inflicted on himself strange and superstitious punishments, and though poor Lady Margaret, knowing that her heart was not burdened with the deeds that had taken place, bore her sad bereavement more tranquilly, yet she could not altogether exculpate herself from the charge of harshness, and she shared in all his penitence and took part in all his grief. Though remorse often goes with long life, yet such was not the case here. Sir Richard Langley died after 4 or 5 years of unavailing regret, and Lady Margaret remained as you have seen her, changed, very much changed, from what she once was, but yet with fine and noble principles at heart. She was always of a somewhat wild and enthusiastic temper of mind, and that disposition has deviated of late into great eccentricity of character. The thing that she has most loved and cherished, if not the only thing, has been that faithful dog, which was saved when young from the burning castle of your poor father, and which, on the night of your arrival, displayed such strange signs of recognition. "Oh, I remember him well now," replied Arrah Neil. "There was a sunny bank below the terrace, near a small lake, and I used to lie with my little arms round his shaggy neck, and laugh when in play he bit at the curls of my hair. It seems but as yesterday, now that the dark mist has been removed from my memory. But go on, Charles, I do but stop you." Lord Walton had fallen into a reverie. A sweet one it was, to which he had been led by the picture that she drew of her fair self in infancy. He thought he saw her on the flowery bank, at sport with her rough companion, and he might have paused to gaze long at the pleasant sight, had not her words roused him. "I have no more to tell, dear Arrah," he replied. "The rest of your fate and history you know better than I do, but yet there is one point—" He stopped and gazed upon her as far as the fading light would let him do so, and his heart beat more than he had thought anything on earth could have made it do. Arrah Neil raised her eyes with a look of inquiry to his face, but the inquiry was instantly answered by what she saw there, and with a cheek of crimson she withdrew her glance as soon as it was given. "Arrah," said Lord Walton, in a low and agitated tone, "I have loved you long, longer, I now find, than I myself have known. Ay, Arrah, I have loved you from childhood, and lately I have thought, have hoped, have dreamed, perhaps, that you loved me." Arrah Neil was silent for a moment, only a moment, but she did nothing like anyone else, and once more raising her eyes to his face, she laid her soft hand on his and asked, "Whom have I ever loved but you?" And then the tears rolled over the long lashes and diamonded her cheek. Charles Walton had felt in those few brief moments as he had never felt before, as he had never imagined that he could feel. He, the calm, the firm, the strong-minded, had felt timid as a child before the cottage girl, the object of his long bounty, the partaker of his house's charity. And he knew from that strange sensation how powerful was the love within him, while she, though agitated, though moved, gained from the very pure singleness of the one strong passion which had dwelt in her breast for years, that strength to avow it which he seemed scarcely able to command. But that avowal, once made on her part, though he knew it, though he could not doubt it before, at once restored him to himself again, and casting his arms round her, he called her his own dear bride. A few minutes passed in sweet emotions, in words so broken and confused that they would seem nonsense if here written, in signs and tokens of the heart which form a sacred language that ought not to be transcribed. But then Charles Walton spoke of his sister's approaching marriage, and urged that she whom he loved would that day put the seal upon their fate also. Arrah turned pale and shook her head, and when her lover, with soothing words and kind assurances, sought to remove what he believed to be the mere timid scruples of a young heart to so hasty a marriage, she answered, "No, Charles, no, it is not that. I would not so ill repay your generous kindness, I would not so badly return my benefactor's love, but I cannot, no, I cannot, I ought not, nay, I dare not unite my fate with yours till all doubt is removed of who and what I am. Oh, Charles, I love you deeply. You know it. You must have seen it. But yet, in truth and deep sincerity, I tell you that, even if you had condescended to wed the poor, wild, peasant girl, as you knew her long ago, Arrah Neil had too much love for Charles Walton to let him so degrade himself. No, as your equal by birth, however much inferior in mind and every other quality, I am yours when you will. I will not say a word, I will not plead even for a day's delay. But there must be no doubt. It must be all proved." "My dearest Arrah," replied her lover tenderly, "I have no doubt. All is clear, all is proved to me." "But not to the world, Charles, not to the world," she answered. "You have yourself admitted it, and you must not, indeed, you must not urge me, if you would not make me unhappy either to refuse aught that you ask, or to do that which I think wrong." Still he would have persuaded, but she gazed at him reproachfully, saying, "Oh, Charles, forbear!" And he felt her heart beat violently beneath his arm. "Well then, Arrah," he said in a somewhat mournful tone, "remember, my beloved, you have promised that whenever these papers can be found, and I trust that will be soon, or that your birth be by any other means clearly established, you will be mine without delay." "The instant that you ask me," replied Arrah Neil, and shortly after Charles Walton led her back to the arms of Lady Margaret Langley. He left her there, hurried out to the houses where his men were lodged, and seeking out old Major Randall, bade him to send a small party in the direction of Bishop's Merton, with orders to inquire for Captain Bearcolt at every village on the way. "In that part of the country," he said, anticipating the old soldier's objections, "I find that the parliamentary party dare not show their faces, and there can be no danger of a surprise. Lord Hertford's people keep the Roundheads down." "Oh, I have no objection, my good lord," answered Major Randall drily. "I could as ill spare Bearcolt as your lordship, though he has been too much absent from his troop of late. But if it be for his majesty's service, I have naught to say. However, in time of need he always proves himself a good soldier, and in time of idleness he amuses me, which few things do nowadays. I can hardly make him out yet, after having known him 10 years or more, for I never knew anyone but himself who was a braggart and a brave man, a liar and an honest one. However, I will send out a party tonight, as your lordship seems anxious." The old officer went forth to do as he proposed, but Lord Walton did not return at once to his dwelling, as might be supposed. On the contrary, he remained in Major Randall's quarters, buried in deep thought, so intense, so absorbing, that several persons came and went without his perceiving them. For months he had struggled against the passion in his bosom. He had struggled successfully, not to crush, but to restrain it, and like a dammed-up torrent, it had gone on increasing in power behind the barrier that confined it, till now that the obstacle was removed, it rushed forth with overwhelming power. There was an eager, a vehement, and almost apprehensive longing to call her he loved his own, which can only be felt by a strong spirit that has resisted its own impulses. There was a fear that it never would be, a vague impression that some unforeseen impediment, some change, some danger, nay, perhaps death itself, would interpose and forbid it. And when he roused himself with a start, he resolved to urge Arrah with every argument to cast aside all her scruples and be his at once. He found her seated by Lady Margaret, the old woman's hands in hers, and the staghound's head upon her knee, and there evidently had been agitating but tender words passing. For Arrah's eyes were full of tears, though there was a sweet smile upon her lip. Charles Walton was too full of his errand for any concealment. He told Lady Margaret all, and besought her to join her persuasions to his, which she did joyfully. But the fair girl resisted, gently, sweetly, yet firmly, even though he spoke of the chances of his own death. The thought brought bright drops into her eyes again, but still she besought him not to ask her, and looked so mournfully in his face when he seemed to doubt her love, that he was once more forced to yield. What was it that made her resolute against his wishes, ay, against the dearest feelings of her own heart? There was a dread, a fancy, that if she became Charles Walton's wife, and the proofs of her birth should never be discovered, he might regret what he had done, that he might wish the words unspoken, the bond of their union broken. She did not do him full justice, but the very idea was agony, and though she knew that, whatever he might feel in such a case, he was too generous to let her perceive his regret, yet she saw sufficiently into her own heart to be sure that she should doubt and fear, and that no peace, no joy would ever be hers, if in her marriage to him there was one cause which could produce reasonable regret. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of Arrah Neil by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 47. It was a bright, sunny morning, when walking forth as if for some mere morning's excursion, the Earl of Beverley, with Lady Margaret Langley leaning on his arm, and Lord Walton with his sister, took their way to the old church in Shrewsbury. Arrah Neil, with old Major Randall and one or two of the servants, had gone a different way, for Annie Walton, though the customs of those days were different, did not wish in the midst of civil war, confusion, and bloodshed, to checker sadder scenes with the spectacle of a gay wedding. One by one they entered the church. There was no gazing crowd to witness. All was quiet and even solemn, but the bright smile of the morning cheered the fair bride's heart, and lent to imagination an augury of happy hours. The ceremony was soon over, and Lord Walton gave his sister to his friend, undoubtedly with joy and satisfaction. Yet he could not refrain one bitter sigh, or forbear from turning his eyes sadly and reproachfully to Arrah Neil. But that glance was met by so tender, so imploring a look from that fair and speaking face, that he easily read in it that to hold her resolution cost her as much as it cost him. 4 or 5 days passed after sweet Annie Walton had become the wife of Lord Beverley, and still no news had been received from Bishop's Merton. The king had returned some time before to Shrewsbury, Many bodies of men had flocked to his standard. Reports favourable to his cause had been rife. Risings in his favour on the road to London had been rumoured, and news had been received that under the very walls of Worcester Prince Rupert's fiery horse had defeated a superior party of the enemy. Everyone began to speak of a speedy advance towards the capital, and all seemed glad of the prospect except Charles Walton. At length the order for preparation was given, and all was bustle and activity. Lord Walton proposed to his aunt to remain with her he loved at Shrewsbury, but Lady Margaret answered, "No, Charles, I will follow you as near as I can, and if I know Arrah aright, she would not stay behind. As soon as you know the direction of your march we will set out, and perhaps may be your harbingers to prepare your quarters for you." "I fear not, my dear boy. These Roundheads are not anthropophagi, and will not eat up women and children." The royal army marched on the following morning, the 12th October, but for 10 days Arrah Neil only saw her lover once, at Bridgenorth, and Annie Walton only once saw her husband, for though the king's leave was given that he should remain for a fortnight more with his bride at Longnow, even love could not keep him from his duty, and love and duty both taught her to follow where he went. No news was heard of an enemy. The march of the king's force was unopposed, and the only inconvenience that was experienced was the frequent want of good provisions. For the false report industriously spread by the agents of the Parliament induced the people of the country to believe that the Cavaliers plundered wherever they went. Day by day, however, Arrah Neil or her fair cousin received letters or messengers from the army, and this was consolation under any privation, till at length, towards the end of October, the small party of ladies, with the servants that attended them, reached the village of South Newington, a few miles from Banbury, and obtained lodging at a large old farmhouse in the neighbourhood, close on the banks of the little Sarbrook. They were indeed glad to find shelter, for the weather was cold and stormy, and the good farmer received them willingly enough, and prayed the king might prosper. For the vicinity of a parliamentary garrison in Banbury had taught the peasantry, though somewhat late in the day, that gross tyranny can be exercised in the name of liberty, and bitter injustice practised by those who have ever equity on their lips. It was about 3 in the afternoon when they reached the farmhouse, and while hasty preparations were being made for their accommodation, which the extent of the building rendered not very difficult, Arrah Neil stood at the window gazing out upon the fields, the sky, and the stream. Heavy leaden clouds hung overhead, and shut out the blue of heaven and the beams of the sun. A dull grey shower was pouring down upon the earth, dimming the bright colouring of the autumnal foliage. The stream ran turbid, with a sad and solemn murmur, and the hoarse wind howled as it passed the casement. Her thoughts were as gloomy as the scene, and something like the dark shadow which used formerly to come over her seemed to rest upon her spirit. The old staghound stalked up and put his muzzle in her hand, but she noticed him not. The servants came and went, but she saw them not. Lady Margaret spoke, but her ears did not catch the sounds. At length Lady Beverley pronounced her name, and Arrah Neil started, for the tones were like those of Lord Walton, and she was turning round to reply when her eye caught sight of 2 cavaliers riding into the court. A look of joy instantly spread over her face, and she exclaimed, "Oh, Annie, dear Annie, there is Captain Bearcolt, and Charles will be happy now." As soon as he could spring from his horse and find his way up the stairs, Captain Bearcolt was in the room. He was very pale and very thin, and Annie Walton thought for a moment that he must be the bearer of evil tidings, but his well-satisfied smile soon set her fears at rest. "What news? What news, sir?" exclaimed Lady Margaret, who had shared the apprehensions of her niece. "None but what is good, madam," replied the captain. "Lord Walton has honoured me by making me his messenger from Edgecote, where he is now with his majesty. No enemy is near. Banbury is about to be besieged, and consequently cavalry is out of fashion, so we shall have 3 or 4 days' repose, for they will doubtless hold out that time for their honour, and, to say truth, I myself shall not be sorry for a little rest, having been let blood pretty sharply since I stood last in this fair presence. I can bear bleeding, methinks, as well as most men, being somewhat accustomed to the process, but this Master Dry of Longsoken was an unskilful leech, and took so much that there was very little left, and I was obliged to lie in bed at Chippenham for 10 days. "But you are wet, Captain Bearcolt, and fatigued," said Lady Beverley. "Will you take some refreshment?" "Not before I have done my errand, bright lady," replied the officer, "which is simply to tell you that my Lord Walton and your noble lord will be here with all speed, and to give this packet to another fair lady, in whose cause I have laboured and suffered successfully." And approaching Arrah Neil, who had been listening with eager attention to every word that fell from his lips, he kissed her hand and gave her her lover's letter. She took it and read it eagerly, while her heart beat fast and her brain almost turned giddy with joy. "My own beloved," it ran, "Bearcolt joined me last night, delayed by accidents which he will tell you. He brings with him all the papers which were plundered from the cottage of poor old Neil, and they, beyond all question, together with the others we possess, establish your birth and your rights. I enclose them for your comfort. Show them to Lady Margaret. And, dearest Arrah, remember the promise that you made to me. We halt here for 3 days. I will be with you in an hour, not to part with you again till you are the bride of him who loves you more than life. Charles Walton." Arrah paused for a moment or two, and leaned upon the table. Her hand that held the letter shook, and her cheek glowed, but there was light in her beautiful eyes, and a smile upon her sweet lip. Then, calmly gliding forward to Lady Margaret, she gave the papers which her lover's letter had contained, saying, "Now, indeed, I am beyond all doubt your child." Then, turning to her cousin, she placed Charles Walton's letter in her hand, gazing on her face while she read it, with a look calm but full of many thoughts and feelings. Lady Beverley, when she had done, cast her arm round her, whispering, "My dear Arrah, now I think he has a right to expect—" "Everything that love and gratitude can prompt," replied her fair companion. "I would not thwart him, even in a thought, Annie. To you, sir," she continued, speaking aloud, and addressing Captain Bearcolt, "I owe an infinite debt, which I must trust to those who can acquit it better to acknowledge fully and discharge. But indeed, Annie, he needs tendance and refreshment. See, Lady Margaret is moved. Will you order him what is needful?" "By your permission, fair ladies, I will even take care of myself," answered the redoubtable captain. "It is a trade I am accustomed to, I can assure you, and wherever bread and bacon, ale and wine are to be found, I am quite equal to find them out." "Pray do, sir, pray do," said Lady Beverley, and Captain Bearcolt left them to themselves. The moments that intervened before the arrival of those who were expected were full of agitation. The papers which Bearcolt had recovered from the house of Dry at Longsoken were carefully examined, and the full proofs of Arrah's birth were found beyond all doubt. Amongst the rest were several letters of Lady Margaret and her daughter, and a letter from the husband of the latter to his unhappy wife on the day preceding his execution. Besides these were several documents, showing that the small sum which had been annually paid to Sergeant Neil proceeded from a cousin of the poor girl's father, who had embraced the ecclesiastical profession, and was the abbot of a monastery on the continent. He, O'Donnell, and old Neil himself were the only persons entrusted with the secret of Arrah's birth, but it appeared from one of the letters of a late date that the Abbé Tyrone was still living, so that, if any further testimony had been required, he could have furnished it. Beneath these papers was a parchment, freshly written, signed and sealed by the king, and countersigned by the proper officers, reversing the attainder of poor Arrah's father, and declaring the confiscated estates restored. A momentary gleam of light beamed forth upon her dark fate, how soon to be eclipsed again. Some half hour was thus consumed, and then the thoughts of all turned happily to the expected arrival of those they loved. Ere an hour after Captain Bearcolt's arrival had passed, Arrah Neil placed herself once more at the window to watch for their coming. She had not gazed long through the decreasing light when her ear caught the sound of horses' feet, and in a moment after, Charles Walton and the Earl, followed by a few servants, rode up at a quick pace. They were accompanied, however, by another gentleman in a black cassock, and a cloak to keep him from the rain, and the poor girl's heart fluttered wildly at the sight. But, still giving way to the impulse, she only paused to exclaim, "Here they are, dear Annie," and running down to the door, was soon in Charles Walton's arms. "Dear one," said the young nobleman as he pressed her to his heart, reading her deep love in her eyes. "I have come to put you to a trial, my Arrah, and see whether you will keep your promise frankly." "To the letter and with pleasure, Charles," replied Arrah Neil in a low murmur that reached no ear but his. "To-night?" asked Lord Walton. "The king's chaplain must return. All forms are already cleared away." "This very hour, if you desire it," answered she whom he loved. "Your lightest wish is my law, henceforth till death." Charles Walton could not reply, but taking her hand, he led her to the chaplain, and then conducted him under her guidance to the room above. We need not pause upon explanations. All was soon arranged and determined. After a brief and sober meal, and with none but one or two of the servants and Captain Bearcolt present, the party formed a circle round, and the chaplain opened the book. In the silence that succeeded, the howling of the wind and the pattering of the rain were heard, and Arrah Neil turned an anxious glance towards the casement, for though her bosom was full of deep and strong emotions, there was something in the sound that seemed to connect itself with them. Charles Walton saw but her, thought of her alone, and after a brief pause the chaplain went on. Word by word he read the whole service through. The vow was plighted, the ring was on the finger, and, with joy he had feared that he might never know, Charles Walton held Arrah Neil to his bosom as his wife. Silence had spread over the world for some hours. It was between 2 and 3 in the morning, and as dark as the grave, when first a horse's foot was heard coming at full speed, and then came loud knocking at the door. All those who slept roused themselves, and in a few minutes there were steps upon the stairs. The voice of Captain Bearcolt was then heard speaking to the Earl of Beverley. "The king has sent, my lord," he said, "to order us to draw to a rendezvous at the top of Edge Hill, near Kyneton. Lord Essex is in force in the valley below, and it is resolved to give him battle. We will cut him to mincemeat." "Tell Lord Walton," said the voice of the Earl, "knock at the opposite door." But ere Captain Bearcolt could follow these directions, the young lord came out, partly dressed. "See that the horses be fed instantly, Bearcolt," said Charles Walton, "and have them saddled. I will join you in a few minutes." And he retired. His bride rose and cast her arms round him in silence. "Nay, Arrah, dear Arrah, I must go where my king commands," he said, struggling against the feelings of his own heart. "I know it, Charles," she answered, in a far calmer tone than he had expected. "I would not keep you for aught on earth, but let me go with you, my dear husband. I shall have no fear. I will stay upon some hill as I did once before, and witness my hero fighting for his king." "Impossible, impossible, dear girl," he replied. "This is a very different affair. To-night I trust in God's mercy to return and tell you that we have won the victory and regained our monarch's throne. It must be so, indeed, my beloved. You know not what you ask." Arrah paused in sad and silent thought for a moment, and then said, "Well, let me be with you to the last before you go," and dressing herself hastily, she followed him down. Lady Beverley was soon by her side. Few words were spoken. All was quick preparation, and ere 4 o'clock, with pale, anxious faces, those two fair girls took one more embrace and saw their husbands ride away into the darkness. It had ceased raining, but it was bitter cold, and the wind blew sharply in. Yet they gazed forth as long as even fancy could show the receding forms, and then, linked arm in arm, they retired to Lady Beverley's room to pray, each asking her own heart the question she did not dare to utter aloud: "Who will return? Who rest upon the field?" There was a faint streak of grey in the sky when they parted, and Annie counselled her fair cousin to lie down and try to sleep. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of Arrah Neil by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 48. The morning of Sunday the 21st of October broke dull and cold. The grey clouds swept hurriedly over the sky, like charging squadrons, and the wind whistled through the branches of a solitary clump of old beeches, which marked the highest point of the sharp rise called Edge Hill. From the brow might be seen a wide open slope, extending down nearly to the little town of Kyneton, or Kyneton, with some flat meadows at the bottom, having a number of hedges and enclosures on the left as one looked from the hill. On the other side all was at that time open, and the fair undulations of Warwickshire might be seen beyond, the brown woods clothed in a light mist. It was a peaceful and pleasant scene in the grey morning, notwithstanding the coldness and dullness of the day, and very soon after dawn the pale blue smoke began to rise from the early chimneys of the little town, rising slow till it was caught by the wind from the hill, and then hurrying away with a few light rolls and losing itself in air. Shortly after, a drum was heard to beat below, and then came the blast of a trumpet, and soon troops might be descried forming slowly and quietly in the plain, as if about to commence a safe and easy march. Horse and foot took their places in long line, and here and there officers and camp followers were seen walking carelessly about, while at other spots some more rigid disciplinarians might be observed putting their men into better order, and galloping hither and thither in all the bustle of command. Suddenly, however, some confusion was observed in one part of the plain, where a group of gentlemen on horseback had been visible for some time, and two persons detached themselves from the rest and rode up at full speed towards the brow of the hill, towards which all eyes were now turned. What saw they there which caused such apparent surprise? It was a small party of horse, not more than 20 in number, which had just moved up from the other side, and now halted, gazing into the valley. There were scarfs and plumes and glittering arms amongst them, betokening no peaceful occupation, and after a moment's pause a trumpeter mounted on a grey horse put his instrument to his lips and blew a long, loud blast. The next moment fresh heads appeared above the hedge, and troop after troop rode forward, and in fair array took up a position at the summit. All was changed on the plain below in a moment. Activity and temporary confusion succeeded the quiet regularity which before had been observable. The two horsemen who had been detached to the group in front were hurriedly recalled, musketeers were seen filing off to the left, and cavalry was collected on the wings. The foot began to form line in the centre, and the party which had remained a little in advance were discovered moving slowly along quite across the valley, while from time to time a horseman dashed away from it and seemed to convey orders to this or that regiment in different parts of the field. Essex was now first aware of the presence of an enemy, and easily divined that he could march no farther without fighting. But it is more with those above that we have to do. Soon after the small body of cavaliers on the hill had been discovered by the Roundhead army, up came at headlong speed, followed by some 8 or 10 gentlemen who could pace with him, a fiery-looking youth, with his beaver up and his eye lightning with eager impetuosity. He seemed barely 21 years of age, but there was on his brow the look of habitual command, and in the quick roll of his eye over the parliamentary army, the sudden impulse it made here and there, and then its rapid turn towards another point, one might see how closely he scanned the forces of the enemy, how keenly he observed all that seemed worthy of attention. "They see us, your highness," said one of the gentlemen who had arrived before him. "They were actually commencing their march when we appeared." "They would not have marched far, my lord," replied Prince Rupert, "but 'tis as well as it is. There are more of them than I thought, but we must make valour supply numbers. I heard that they had 2 regiments behind at Stratford. "There are, sir, 2 of infantry and 1 of cavalry," replied Lord Walton, "but that seems to me the best of all reasons for giving battle as soon as possible." "The very best," answered the prince, with a smile. "Victory is more needful to us than food, and of that we have had no great plenty. But, by my life, there is not a regiment of foot within sight. The foot are sad encumbrances. Would that these times were like the days of old, when every gentleman fought on horseback. We are fallen upon vulgar days." "I see the head of a regiment amongst those distant hedges," said the Earl of Beverley, "but our quarters were very much scattered last night." "And some noble persons had fair young wives to visit, my good lord," replied the prince, bowing his head with a smile. "True," rejoined the earl, "but yet your highness sees they are not the last in the field, as how they should be when they have such treasures to defend, such eyes for witnesses." The reply suited the prince well, and after some more gay conversation he dismounted from his horse and seated himself under one of the beech trees, watching attentively every movement of the enemy, and from time to time pointing out to those around him the measures taken by Lord Essex for defence. "See," he said, "he is filling those hedges with musketeers. Aston and his dragoons must clear them. I will not break my teeth upon such stones. He is forming a powerful reserve there, I suppose, under Ramsay or the Earl of Bedford, and he has got all his foot in the centre. Who is that on the left, I wonder? Well, I shall soon know, for I trust it will not be long before I see him closer. Would to heaven these tardy foot would come! We are giving him full time for every arrangement he could desire, and you may be sure he will not stir from amongst those hedges till we dislodge him." But the impatient prince had long to wait, for 10 o'clock was near at hand ere the first regiment of royal artillery was on the ground. From that time, indeed, every quarter of an hour brought up some fresh body, but even then the men had marched far and needed some refreshment. All that could be given them was a brief space of repose and some cold water, for provisions were not to be obtained. The soldiery, however, were full of ardour, and many a gay jest and gibe passed amongst those who were never destined to quit that plain. Amongst other events that have been noticed by historians is the fact that the King's Guard, composed entirely of gentlemen volunteers, having heard as they followed the monarch some slight scoffs at their peculiar post near his person, besought him to dispense with their close attendance that day, and obtained permission to charge with the cavalry of Prince Rupert on the right. On the left, a smaller body of horse, commanded by Commissary General Wilmot, and a regiment of dragoons under Sir Arthur Aston, had the task of assailing the right of the parliamentary army, protected as it was by enclosures lined with musketeers; and to this service the small corps of the Earl of Beverley was also assigned. Lord Walton fought upon the right under the prince, and but one regiment of cavalry, led by Sir John Byron, was kept back as a reserve. 1 o'clock had passed, when at length, after a short consultation with the Earl of Lindsey, the king commanded his forces to march slowly down the hill towards Kyneton. The distance was considerable, and before the ground was reached on which it was thought advisable to begin the battle, the day had so far advanced that some old and experienced officers suggested a delay till the following morning. But sufficient arguments were not wanting to show that Essex must gain and his sovereign lose by such a course. The troops, too, were eager to engage, and a very general belief prevailed that few of the parliamentary regiments would really be brought to fight against their king. In the confusion of all accounts, it is hardly to be discovered how the battle really commenced, but certain it is that Prince Rupert burst into fury at the very thought of delay, and that his force of cavalry first commenced the fight by charging the left of the enemy. As he was waiting to give the word, with all his blood on fire at the thought of the approaching strife, he remarked Lord Walton twice turn round and gaze towards the hill in the rear, and he asked in a sharp tone, "What look you for, my lords? Soldiers ever should look forward." Charles Walton's brow became as dark as night, and it cost him a moment's thought ere he could reply with calmness. "I looked, sir, for one I thought I saw upon the hill as we moved down; and as to the rest, Rupert of Bavaria has never been more forward on the field, nor ever will be, than Charles Walton. But there is other matter to attend to now. See you that regiment of horse advancing to the charge?" The prince looked round, and beheld a considerable body of the enemy coming on at a quick pace, pistol in hand. He raised his sword above his head, about to speak the word, but at that moment the opposite party discharged their shot into the ground, and galloping on, wheeled their horses into line with the cavaliers. A buzz ran through the ranks of "Fortescue! Fortescue!" He was forced to join the Roundheads. Many more are in the like case. And at the same moment the cry of "Charge!" was heard, and hurled like a thunderbolt against the mass of the enemy's cavalry on the left. With the prince at their head, the gallant force of cavaliers rushed on. A fire, innocuous from the terror and confusion with which it was directed, was opened upon their advancing line, but ere swords crossed, the parliamentary cavalry of the left wing, with the exception of one small body, turned the rein and fled. The cavaliers thundered on the flank and rear. Men and horses rolled over together, and foremost in the fight, wherever a show of resistance was made, was the bridegroom of a day. "Lightning and devils!" cried Captain Bearcolt, who followed hard upon his steps. "See what love will make a man do! He has distanced the prince by 6 horse lengths, and he will give that standard in a minute. Come, my lord, let a man have his share." On they rushed, pursuers and pursued, along the plain, over the hill. Down went Steel Jack, and Buff Coat, and Iron Morion. Some turned at last to strike one stroke for life, but still the fiery spurs of Rupert and of Walton were behind them, and Edgehill Field was far away when the prince himself cried, "Halt! Sound to the standard! Stay, Walton, stay! You have outstripped me indeed." Lord Walton drew his rein, but he raised not his visor. Footnote: We do not always remember that in the reign of Charles I. the cavalry were in general defended by casques with movable visors. The dragoons, indeed, had usually an open helmet. End footnote. But he raised not his visor, for he felt that he was pale. "Methinks we are too far from the field, your highness," he replied. "I will ride back with speed, for my men have followed close behind me, while you rally the rest and bring them up. I fear some mischance, for the king is without guards." "Go, go," said the prince, instantly perceiving the error that had been committed. "I will come after with all speed. Sound trumpet, sound trumpet, sound to the standard." "Call them back, Bearcolt, and follow," exclaimed Lord Walton. "Old Randall is as mad as any of us. Bring him back, quick. I fear we have spoiled the best day's deeds England has seen for long." And gathering together what men he could, he spurred headlong back towards the field. Captain Bearcolt followed on his steps, and he thought he saw the young lord waver somewhat in the saddle. A stream of blood, too, was trickling down his scarf from his right shoulder, and spurring on his horse to Charles Walton's side, he said, "You are wounded, sir. You are badly wounded. Let me lead you to—" But at that moment the field of battle came again before their eyes, and Lord Walton exclaimed, "Is this time to talk of wounds? Look there!" The aspect of the scene had indeed greatly changed from what it had been some half an hour before, when Wilmot and Aston on the left, and Rupert on the right, were driving the Roundhead cavalry before them. Firm in his position stood the Earl of Essex with his foot. His reserve of horse had come down, and were charging the royal infantry. The right wing, the left, and the reserve of Charles's horse were far away, pursuing the flying foe, and the monarch himself, with his 2 sons, only guarded by a small force of mounted cavaliers, who had been too wise and loyal to follow the rash example set them by the prince, appeared nearly surrounded by the parliamentary cavalry under Sir William Balfour. As Lord Walton reappeared upon the field, the royal standard wavered and fell, and in the midst of the fierce fire that rolled along the front of the enemy's line, he charged upon the flank of Balfour's horse to rescue his sovereign from the peril he was in. As they galloped up, however, the standard rose again, and Essex's reserve began slowly to retire upon the infantry. But still the young nobleman urged on his little troop upon the retreating force. Some 50 gentlemen detached themselves from the small body that surrounded the monarch, and charging in front, and cutting their way clear through, Charles Walton and Francis of Beverley met in the midst of the melee. "How goes it, Charles?" said the Earl, with a glad voice. "If the Prince would but return, we would have a glorious victory." "He is coming quickly," replied Lord Walton. "Rally your force with mine, Beverley, for one more charge." And in another minute they were again in the midst of the retreating rebels. At the same moment, in sad confusion and disarray, came back Prince Rupert's cavaliers. Discipline and order were lost amongst them. Officers were without men, and men without officers. Some few joined the troops of Lord Beverley and Lord Walton. But night was falling. Sir William Balfour led his horse in between the regiments of infantry steadily and skilfully, then turned to face the enemy. And the Earl, finding that nothing could be effected without a larger force, retreated and galloped up to Prince Rupert, who now stood near the king, to urge one decisive charge upon the centre of the parliamentary line. The prince received him coldly, however, perhaps from a consciousness that he himself had done amiss, and someone suggested that the king should leave the field, pointing out how firmly Lord Essex kept his ground. For shame! Cried the Earl. "The victory might still be ours, but certainly it is not his, and as long as his Majesty remains it cannot be so. The greater part of our foot is unbroken, our horse is victorious, and whoever quits the field, I will remain upon it, dead or alive." "And I too, most certainly, my lord," said Charles. "I will never do so unkingly an act as to forsake them who have forsaken all to serve me. There is no look of victory on my Lord Essex's side. We keep the field. Let them advance to attack us if they dare. Take measures to withdraw those cannon from that little mound. Restore what order may be, for night is falling fast, and set a sure guard that we be not surprised." For some time the discharge of musketry, which was still going on, continued upon both sides, but gradually, as the darkness increased, it slackened, revived, slackened again, fell into dropping shots, and then fires began to appear along the line of either enemy, while all the confusion and disarray which ever succeeds a drawn battle, where the combatants are only parted by the night, took place on either part. Hours were spent in giving some sort of order to the royalist forces. Officers sought their men, soldiers looked for their officers, rumours of every kind were spread, and many accidents and misadventures happened, which cannot here be told. But there was one sad subject of thought that occupied many a mind. Who had fallen? Who remained wounded on the field? It was impossible to discover, for the confusion was so great that no one knew where the other was to be found. Lord Beverley, however, had seen Charles Walton almost to the latest moment of the strife, and in sending off a messenger to Newington to inform his fair bride of his own safety, he ventured to add that her brother, also, had escaped the slaughter of the day. About midnight, however, as he was lying by a fire, he heard a step approach, and looking up, he saw Bearcolt beside him. The soldier's eyes gazed round the group, which lay in the glare, and before the Earl could speak, he said, "So he is not here?" "Do you mean Lord Walton?" asked the Earl. "Ay, to be sure, my lord," replied Bearcolt. "I have been seeking you these 2 hours, and now we had better go and seek him, for depend upon it, he is on the field. He was badly wounded with a shot in the side in that first charge, and he got another in the last, but perhaps he is not dead yet. The night is cold, and that staunches blood." "We have no lights," said the Earl, a cold foreboding coming over his heart. "Stay, the moon will be up in half an hour. Where saw you him last?" "Within half musket shot of the 2nd regiment on the right," answered Bearcolt. "We had better wait, too, till the moon rises. She will give some light, if she do not even chase the clouds, and yet I would fain go soon, for I have strange doubts." "Of what?" asked the Earl. "Nay, I do not well know," replied the soldier, "but I know one thing, that sweet lady of his was not so far from the field as he wished and others thought. Just as we were moving down, I saw her, or her ghost, and a countryman with his hand upon her horse's bridle, as if leading him over the rough ground on the left. Her lord saw her too, or I am mistaken, for he more than once turned to look, and there were words between him and the prince about it." The Earl put his hand to his brow in that sort of painful dread which, without taking any definite form, hangs like a dark cloud over the whole range of destiny. "You saw her near the field?" he said. "You saw her here? When was this?" "Why, I told you, my good lord, just as we were moving down, about 1 of the clock," answered Captain Bearcolt. "But there is a little cottage where a shepherd lives, up along the edge of the hill. Perhaps she has taken refuge there, or, it may be, she has gone back." "God grant it," said the Earl. "I will send up to the cottage to see if she be there." Bearcolt, however, undertook the task himself, saying that in such a piercing night the walk would warm him. But he found the cottage deserted, and though there was sufficient light to guide him back to the spot where the Earl of Beverley lay, the moon did not show herself all night. The darkness remained as profound as ever. Neither lantern nor torch could be procured, and it was perfectly hopeless to attempt a search under such circumstances. Weary hour by hour passed away beside the fire, till it died away for want of fuel. But still, notwithstanding all the fatigue that they had endured, Lord Beverley and his companion sat wakeful till the dawn of morning, and during their conversation Bearcolt showed a depth of feeling and an interest in the fate of Charles Walton and Arrah Neil, which raised him much in the opinion of the Earl. As soon as the first grey streaks announced the coming day, Lord Beverley was on horseback with his troop, but there before him stood the parliamentary army, reinforced rather than diminished since the night before. It was impossible to approach the part of the field where Lord Walton had last been seen, except with a large force, but 4 pieces of the enemy's artillery were seen, considerably in advance of their line in that direction; and at the suggestion of Bearcolt, the Earl asked and obtained leave to make a charge with his own troop and that of Major Randall, to endeavour to capture some of the cannon. This, as is well known, was effected early in the morning, without much loss or opposition, but the chief object of the Earl, the discovering of his friend's body, could not be accomplished. The rest of the events of that day are familiar to everyone. The greater part of the morning was spent in consultations on the royalist part, and in fruitless endeavours to induce the officers to make one great effort against the enemy, till, towards evening, both armies began to retire, the first movement of retreat being made by the Parliament forces, which were followed for a considerable distance by the royalist cavalry. For 10 miles the Earl of Beverley joined in the pursuit, but then obtained leave to return to the field, and his sad search began. It was long protracted, and night was again beginning to fall, when a low, fierce growl, as he walked along one of the hedges on the right, called his attention to a pit which had been dug at the foot of a small oak tree. A little path ran down amongst some bushes, and hurrying along it, with Bearcolt and several of his men, he reached the bottom. There they found 2 or 3 wounded soldiers, who had dragged themselves thither to die, but in the midst was the saddest sight of all. Prone upon the ground, with the head uncovered, lay the body of Charles Walton, but that head was pillowed on the arm of poor Arrah Neil. Her lips seemed to have been pressed upon his, for her fair face had fallen forward upon his neck, and her bosom rested on his steel cuirass, while her left arm hung over him, the hand half clasping his right. Beside them, gazing down upon the poor girl, with drooping ears and tail, stood the gaunt staghound, and the faithful beast turned fiercely upon the first man who approached. He recognised the Earl, however, and took a step or 2 forward towards him with a faint howl, and then returned and gazed again on her with whom he had sported in her childhood. Lord Beverley knelt down and gently took her hand. It was cold as ice, but there was a keen frost, and he touched her cheek, removing the rich ringlets of her hair which had fallen over her face. There was some warmth left, and raising her in his arms, he directed her to be carried into the little town of Kyneton, now in possession of the royalist cavalry, with the body of her husband. But Arrah never spoke again. It was evident that she had come in time to receive the last breath of him she loved, for the fingers of Lord Walton's left hand were found tightly closed upon her garments, but how she had found him, or when, could not be discovered. All that was ever learned was, that one of the ploughmen of the farm at Newington had guided her to Edge Hill, and that from the summit she had witnessed the battle below. But at night, as she would not return, the man had left her, and all the rest was darkness. Every effort was made to recall her to herself, but all was in vain, and in about 2 hours after she had been removed to Kyneton, the last feeble spark of life that was left went out, and she was buried in the same grave with her husband in less than a week from her marriage day. Such was the fate of one of the fairest and the gentlest of human beings. It would be a sad fact that virtue and good conduct, that the highest qualities of the mind and the heart, cannot always command success or ensure happiness, but that we have the grand assurance, both in God's word and in God's goodness, that there is a place where there is compensation and reward, that the very brightest and the very best of human efforts often do not obtain their recompense here, has been admitted by the most sceptical of philosophers as a strong evidence of a future state. Our hopes and expectations are founded on a higher and better basis, and we are permitted to see, even in the sorrows of the good, the trial of that faith which is the assurance of immortality. We might well close our history here and close it in sadness, but as there are almost always some mitigating circumstances in the course of disastrous events, we may be allowed to take off a little from the tragic character of the conclusion of this tale by speaking of the after-history of other persons who have figures in the scene, and the reader is always anxious more or less to hear the ultimate fate of those in whom he has taken an interest. To speak of the more important personages, then, in the first place, it may well be supposed that the Earl of Beverley mourned sincerely for his friend, and his grief was somewhat aggravated by the powers of imagination. For the fact that his persuasions had been the immediate cause of Lord Walton joining the royal standard connected itself closely with the dream which he had had in prison, and brought a shadow over him whenever the events of the day gave him time for thought. He himself went safely through all the scenes of the Civil War, remaining uninjured, except from a slight wound which he received at Long Marston Moor. His fair lady followed him as closely as was possible throughout the whole of those eventful times, and she was as happy as unchanging love and affection could make her, amidst the disasters of her country and the overthrow of the royal house to which she was attached. The fall of her brother and the death of his gentle bride affected Annie Walton deeply, and it was long ere she regained the original cheerfulness of her character. But that cheerfulness depended as much upon principle as upon mood, and instead of encouraging grief, she made every effort to regain her serenity. After the total ruin of the Cavalier party, the Earl and his wife retired to France, and continued to live there in almost total seclusion till the restoration of the House of Stuart brought them back to their native land, where, though they met with the neglect which in those days, as it is in all, was too frequently the reward of good services, they bore it with perfect indifference, happy in mutual affection and requiring nothing else to complete their felicity. A short time before they quitted England, Lady Margaret Langley had left the troublous scene in which they were still moving, for the repose of that quiet mansion which she had long looked to only as a place of rest. But there is still one personage of whose after history we must say a few words. Captain Deciduous Bearcolt continued to serve the king as long as any services could be available, and in no point or particular did he derogate from his high established character. He fought as well, he drank as deeply, he lied as vigorously as we have seen him do in the past narrative, and though in the succeeding wars he got into 1,000 scrapes, in which it required all the genius of a bear-colt to extricate his neck from the halter or his throat from the knife, he contrived, with marvellous ingenuity, to find his way out of circumstances which would have overwhelmed any common man. Nor was he absent from Worcester Field. On the contrary, some have asserted that he was taken prisoner on that occasion, and contrived to deceive the keenness of Cromwell himself. Certain it is that after the restoration of Charles II., Bearcolt returned to England, presented himself at Bishop's Merton, put in a claim to the property of Mr. Dry of Longsoken as the direct heir of old Nicholas Cobalter, and having proved that the will under which Mrs. Cobalter had possessed his uncle's property was a forgery, he established such a debt against the estate of Mr. Dry as speedily rendered him the master of Longsoken. There he continued to reside with an elderly man named Falgate, who played the character, partly of dependent, partly of attached friend, till he had well nigh reached the age of 80 years, when, with a form somewhat bowed, a face somewhat white, and a nose which had gradually turned from red to blue, Colonel Bearcolt of Longsoken sank quietly into the grave, his last words being, "The pottle pot's empty, Diggory." End of chapter 48. End of Arrah Neil, or Times of Old, by George Payne Rainsford James. Read by Lynne Thompson, Tucson, Arizona.